Yes. Good morning. It is really a great pleasure for me, and I'm sure it is as it is for you, this morning to be able to be together for this second event of this year's program of the Victoria International Arts Festival. Obviously, we have to abide by the regulations. Hopefully, they will be a thing of the past next year. And but it's all about music. And today, actually, it is dedicated to one of the really towering German geniuses, who is obviously Beethoven. This morning, my sister Maria will be talking about introducing, as such, this evening's concert recital, which will feature three of his better-known piano sonatas. The first one, it's in C minor. It is better known as the Pathétique. The second one in A flat major, and the third sonata will be in F minor, the Appassionata. They will be. Francis will be playing them in the Aula Monsignor Farrugia. And my sister will be introducing from the historical, intellectual, philosophical point of view of these three absolutely brilliant sonatas, introducing Beethoven. The title of Maria's lecture is Beethoven, a Rebel with a Cause. She will go into that much better than I can ever do. And so please welcome Maria, who will be delivering this morning's lecture. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you, yes. As George said, this lecture was conceived as a sort of framework for this evening's performance by our nephew Francis, who is performing three major sonatas by Beethoven. In fact, I would like to dedicate this talk to him. It was actually the performance which inspired a few ideas which I'd like to share with you. So this talk, these ideas, hopefully will contextualize the background rather than the specific sonatas themselves. That will be done through this evening's program notes, which Francis himself has written. At the end, if you'd like to ask any questions, to discuss anything, I'll be very happy to do that. Okay, so I shall start with a quotation from William Blake, a contemporary of Beethoven in England. In one of his great writings, Visions of the Last Judgment, he says this: poetry, painting, and music, the three powers in man conversing with paradise, which the flood did not sweep away. The ideals of arts and letters change with the seasons of civilization. In antiquity, it was beauty. In the Middle Ages, goodness. In the Enlightenment, truth. However, the veneration of truth in the Enlightenment was soon abandoned with the discovery of the disillusioning fact that the aspect of truth varies according to the angle from which it is approached. In the 18th century, the sense of an absolute had already started to erode. Neither would goodness any longer serve, because the Enlightenment had shown that goodness often hides ulterior motives. Thankfully, man returned to the ideal of beauty in classical antiquity. At the end of the Enlightenment and on the threshold of Romanticism, there were many reasons for recalling the beauty and form of antiquity, one of which was the renewed emphasis placed on the universal. Another weighty reason was the kinship of the Rococo with classicism. Granted that to the early 18th century artist, mythology meant little more than pure ornamentation, cupids and playful antique gods, and lovers who carried classical names. However, it did occasionally conjure up the dance of nymphs and fauns, and the Olympic felicity of Venus and Adonis. A third reason was that rationalism, no less than the Rococo, was bound to rediscover antiquity. If not classical Greece, at least Alexandrian, Etruscan, and Roman antiquity, for the latter cherished the notion of the doctus poeta, the learned poet, as did rationalism. There was a fourth reason, which was the rapprochement of Germanic genius to that of Hellas, that is, of ancient Greece, all of ancient Greece, as the ideal of the new Renaissance concluded an alliance with the fresh spiritual forces of Germandom, if I may be permitted to coin a word. Germany now gave birth to her most representative minds, once invincibly attracted to classical thought, Goethe to Euripides, Kant to Plato. The final reason is really a corollary to the preceding ones. Philosophy, art and literary criticism, and philology, following the urge for a classical orientation, created modern classical philology and modern archaeology. The rebirth of the antique through German genius, in a constantly increasing intensity and creative force, is one of the greatest cultural facts of the 18th century, the century that gave birth to Beethoven. Indeed, one way of defining the period in Europe between 1770 and 1830, coinciding with Romanticism, but also with Beethoven's date of birth in 1770 and his death in 1827, and accounting for its unity and specificity across the varieties of differences of individuals, genres, chronologies, and, last but not least, national traditions, is to regard it as an aesthetic reaction to and compensation for the thrust of an onrushing modernity. Romantic nostalgia develops in a period which sees a rapidly accelerated modernization in all domains of society and life, cultural, political, economic, and so forth. The French Revolution represents the one momentous event that brought this all-pervasive process to consciousness. This is especially true of Germany and England, the two bystanders, as it were, where an intellectual debate ensues on the character and consequences of the shocking historical rupture. All contemporaries, regardless of political partisanship, and many early romantics, including Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Friedrich Schlegel, began as fervent admirers of the revolutionary ideals before they turned against their perceived betrayal and bloody perversion. The French Revolution represents an irreversible break with the old order and the advent of a yet unshaped, unpredictable future, bristling with promise and at the same time profoundly frightening. Within the chasm between the new and the old, nature becomes the suggestive catchphrase for the lost past and everything it seems to embody. It conjures up a world of safeguarded security and gracious authority, a sort of allegorical cultural childhood. Around the turn of the century, the Enlightenment alliance of reason and nature in the name of progress breaks apart. Instead of providing the unquestioned ontological foundation for infinite development, nature is now seen as threatened in its very substance by human reason. Yet, the profound shift in perspective does not represent a radical turn from the universalist and progressivist values of Enlightenment naturalism. Rather, it initiates a thorough re-evaluation of both reason and nature. Nature becomes the ambiguous, paradoxical object of nostalgic longing. But it also holds the resources necessary to bring reason back under its fold. It represents to reason an absolute a priori agency that gives it the status of an all-powerful, all-inclusive subject. The atmosphere of German civilization was kept in flux for a few decades by what is known as the Sturm und Drang, a German term meaning storm and stress. an expression of emotional unrest, and a rejection of neoclassical literary forms. When the movement, whose nature was so admirably expressed by its very name, assured unlimited liberty to the exceptional creative mind, it found a Johann Gottfried Herder among its champions. When it assailed outmoded traditions, when it probed the ills of society, and when it revalued the accepted tenets of ethics, it rallied around Rousseau's gospel. When it sought a legal foundation to bolster up its arbitrariness, it called Shakespeare to witness. For in the latter's excesses, it found justification for the disposal of such restraints as the three unities, as explained by Aristotle. The pathos of the Sturm und Drang was really the transitory mental state of a nation, not a permanent force. Therefore, it only knew extremes, and its revolutionary tendencies usually flickered out with the exhaustion of the pathos that engendered them. However, the apostles of the Sturm und Drang fell victim to the many problems they themselves evoked. The frenzied passions more or less settled and became purified. Rude reality, rude in the sense of stark reality, was transfigured in the fire of ideals. The creative force and form-building willpower united in a common task. The genius recognized the validity of objective norms. Boundless humanism gave way to a humanism which sets its own limits. This moderation ripened into classicism, of which the German phase was the very symbol. Instinct made peace with the law. Form triumphed over matter, order over chaos. Classicism sanctified life, as it were, and gave it validity by viewing it from the heights of the ideal. It abdicated all its past and future rights, abandoned all disquieting desires in order to be able to live in the timeless present. Its art was devoted to the ideal of plastic beauty, which it believed to be absolute. Its principal object was man living in consort with nature, man beautiful in mind and soul, in bearing, in manners, and in deed. Man who became aware of his own inner harmony and who was the measure of all things great. The centuries-long battle for freedom and form, ideal and reality, German aspiration and the forces of antiquity came to a standstill. The sentimental irrationalism of the Sturm und Drang emptied into the quiet world of the ideal, and the result was an aesthetic world picture, a concept of Germany reborn from the spirit of Greece, purified of its conflicts, a Germanized Hellas. This classicism was convinced that there are forms of art and laws of immutable, unchanging, and eternal validity. Drawing from Winckelmann's abstract and stylized conception of Greece, what he calls, and I quote, a noble simplicity and a quiet greatness, unquote, it professed the belief that universality of content and form is not an unattainable fiction, but had been once realized by Greece. Therefore, given the proper conditions, it could be attained again. The classical precepts, evolved by the poets and musicians, stood for unity of freedom and order, a remarkable coincidentia oppositorum, meaning a self-discipline on the one hand, and on the other, a conquest of autonomy such as only the truly great can achieve. They had no propensity to extinguish the individual in the universal. Rather, they wanted to coordinate the two. And what they achieved was the miracle of universalized individualism. To the 19th century, this German synthesis appeared as form, as an abstract pattern which it believed could be segregated and infused with new content, time and again. This idea, happily overcome in literature, was successfully propagated in music, and in the 21st century, students are still being taught to compose in sonata form. Rules came to the classicists not as a predetermined compulsion, but as spiritual law and order, engendered by themselves. Early classicism still had a good deal of the delicate, softer touch of the Rococo. Just as Proudhon and Canova toyed with the delectable forms and subjects of the Rococo before finding their own tone, so Haydn and Mozart were, in the early phases, addicted to the minuets of the era. However, the playfulness and intimacy of the century was on the wane as it approached its final decades. The last great champions of the Enlightenment died. Hume in England, Lessing in Germany, Voltaire in France. And with them departed the rulers, Louis XV, Maria Theresa, Frederick the Great, taking to their grave not only their bodies but a way of life. These are also the decades which witnessed the revolutions in America and in France, lest we forget. After the frills of the Rococo and the robustness of the Enlightenment, storms appear on the horizon. Kant's Critique appears in 1781, the year which produces Schiller's first drama, The Robbers. The objectivity of the Enlightenment is overwhelmed by the tempered subjectivity of late classicism, its critical rationalism by the encroaching of irrational feeling. How truly all this is reflected in the poet, in whom German classicism reaches its synthesis. I'm referring to Goethe. If his first period sees the re-irrationalization of German thought, the second, after the revelations of the Italian journey on which he embarked, becomes the era of poetic sublimation of liberated thought. Faust is the closing masterpiece of Goethe's life, as it is the summit of German literary classicism, assimilating every stratum from the Sturm und Drang to high classicism. So, very superficially, this is sort of the historical, political, and cultural, and basically intellectual context in which Beethoven is born. Beethoven has been called a rebel, a revolutionary, a misanthrope, and God knows what else. He is also routinely described as a visionary and a genius, a man more concerned with humane spiritual matters than political ones, although his observations on the latter are not to be readily dismissed. Many critics subscribe to the intermediate position that Beethoven's early enthusiasm for the French Revolution transformed itself into a romantic concern with the creative power of the imagination, or a version of what Milton calls, I quote, paradise within thee, happy as far, unquote. Other critical positions have played Beethoven as a composer enmeshed in a political milieu, even if he is one who views the distinction between spiritual and political matters as the product of a fallen human consciousness. Whatever the case, whether Beethoven is understood as a political radical, a rebellious genius, or a disillusioned fellow traveler who, like Schubert's Wanderer, announces his journey in the Winterreise by singing, and I quote, I arrived a stranger I depart, unquote, the fact remains that Beethoven is a deeply inspired composer. He is a genius. Music, alongside poetry, has traditionally been identified as the expression that transcends the known world. Yet, if the sublimity of transport could provide a much-desired, newly invigorated sense of self, there remains an anxiety that the continuities of identity should not be destroyed in the process. Behind the idea of transport lurks a ghost that haunts the self with the fear that vision might not always come with a return ticket. In this context, Beethoven, like William Blake, his contemporary across the North Sea, seems to have been prepared to hazard the sense of a continuous and definitive subjectivity in the interests of political and spiritual, as distinct from religious, transformation. Indeed, to momentarily regard Blake, This Romantic poet's later writing regards the casting off of selfhood as essential to the experience of universal brotherhood. In his magnificent poem Jerusalem, Blake writes, I quote, "Annihilate the selfhood in me, be thou all my life," unquote. Schiller makes the same claim in An die Freude, which Beethoven sets in the last movement of his Ninth Symphony, and I quote from Schiller in translation, "All men become brothers where your gentle wings hover, be embraced, ye millions," unquote. Like most of his contemporaries, in his youth, Beethoven was an ardent champion of the French Revolution. And although he remained a confirmed defender of freedom and secularism, eventually he became disillusioned with the ideology of the revolution, even though he retained the revolutionary spirit. But then, that rebellious spirit is inherent in him. From his perspective, the French Revolution had gone too far. All revolutions go too far, regrettably. And he looked back on the reign of terror in France with disgust and horror. Although still anti-monarchist, he was no longer a militant Republican. As is invariably the case, history shows that revolutions, whether political, cultural, or religious, are by and large followed by disenchantment, by an inevitable counter-revolution. A revolution burns as ideal, but it burns itself out as fact. It is doomed to failure when slogans become solutions. As Sebastian says of Gonzalo in Shakespeare's The Tempest, the revolutionary sees the facts, but, quote, doth mistake the truth totally, unquote. Reality and the ideal are at odds here, as they tend to be. Truth, in this ideological context, can only be believed. It precludes understanding, a bit like poetry there. The men and women of 1789, for instance, may have failed to read their own political text, resulting in a disenchantment with their own ideologies. Although we may, in retrospect, look at the revolution as less meaningful now than ever before, like desire, we never fail to be attracted to its fatality and never grow tired of retelling it. And to tell and retell it as a story is to make it mean a great deal. That is the power of narrative on the auditory and imaginative response. The periods that have produced the hell of Rimbaud and the angels of Rilke, the star revolts of Schiller and the ruins of Wordsworth, Goethe's mountains and Schlegel's circuitous routes, Kafka's castle and James's ivory tower, the spirals of Yeats and the hermaphrodites of Proust, the intricate dying god symbolism attached to Christ in Eliot, and the exhaustive treatment of Old Testament myths in Thomas Mann's study of Joseph, are once again great mythopoeic periods. These symbols are the ones we lean against when all else fails. They tell us great stories. Beethoven wrote his own stories, not only in his music, but also in the countless letters he addressed to family, friends, patrons, and publishers. Regarding his famous Heiligenstadt Testament, dated 6th of October 1802, addressed to his brothers, the word, which has caused so much deconstructive angst and Sturm und Drang, means for Beethoven a single comprehensible form. For him, words, like notes, mean clarity of vision and unity of purpose. Cartesian doubt does not prevail with him. What the extraordinary Heiligenstadt Testament bequeaths to his brothers is not money or property, but words on humanity. Even when he leaves them his instruments, priceless instruments, he does urge them to sell them if they need the money. As he says in the Testament, I quote, "O divine being, you who look down into my inmost soul, you understand. You know that love for mankind and a desire to do good dwell therein," unquote. Beethoven's genius revolutionized thinking in the simplest and most effective of ways, by showing us how it's done. And this brings me to a very short section where I discuss the nature of genius, as we can understand it in Beethoven. The most classic of dramas, I'm referring to Goethe's Iphigenia in Tauris, a reworking of Euripides' Iphigenia, announces the redeeming force of pure humanity. Euripides' Deus ex machina is conquered by humanity. The exhilarating problem now was to elevate the individual into the universal. Egmont and Tasso perish, but Faust succeeds. Faust, the Promethean man, beholds Arcady, although his path has led over the dead body of Margaret. Sorry. He is Goethe himself, reaching the eternal peaks of knowledge through the wild Walpurgisnacht, now acquiescing in law and order, whose barriers he had stormed with such vehemence. He is the universal, eternal man, who lives the whole gamut of human experience, and every man, not saved by divine intervention, but by his eternal humanity. As in Goethe and his Faust, one beholds this genius in Beethoven, an exception to the rule. If, as Kant says in Critique of Judgment, the doing, facere, that characterizes art is higher than the acting, agere, of nature, this is because the latter is the result of unthinking causal necessity, while the former is a product of freedom. So, doing implies a deliberate, intentional act, while acting implies automaticity. Always according to Kant, if art is higher than craft, it is because the latter, craft that is a mercenary activity, carried out only for the promise of financial reward, while the former is free and agreeable on its own account, rather than in view of some exterior purpose. So, the mercenary, the financial, right, art of the craftsman, while undeniably deliberate, resembles more the agere of nature than the free doing of the artist, because it is not carried out for its own sake. On the other hand, the free artist departs from natural necessity and works without such external ends or predetermined programs. Genius is the agency which ensures this creative freedom, and it is a structural necessity for Kant's philosophy of art. For, granted the injunction that art must be free from constraint, while at the same time being the result of a deliberate doing, the facere, it follows that in order to meet this condition, natural genius must be posited as the sine qua non, that without which something cannot start, of free artistic activity. So, genius is the capacity to liberate oneself from natural mechanisms and rule-governed paradigms. But, crucially, it grants this only in so much as one allows one's hand to be steered by nature. In the third critique, titled categorically, Fine Art is the Art of Genius, Kant first states the case for genius as being the only sufficient ground for the existence of such a thing as fine art. Genius, rather than being an ideological fancy, is for Kant a structurally necessary concept. In simple terms, fine art is only possible as the product of genius. The essential principles of this concept, along with the function it performs, are schematically outlined in a very long passage in the third critique. For the purpose of this paper, it suffices to quote just one sentence from that. And I quote, "Genius is a talent for producing something for which no determinate rule can be given. It's not a predisposition consisting of a skill for something that can be learned by following some rule or other. Hence, the foremost property of genius must be originality. The talent, the innate predisposition, what he calls the ingenium, which gives art its rules, unquote. Thus, genius does not derive from any rule and cannot be learned by following a set of instructions. It follows that originality must be the primary quality and identifiable mark of genius. The ability to create something singular, unique, and unanticipated, which is not simply brought about by working to pre-given rules. Or, to use Jacques Derrida's words, I quote, "The genius of the genius, if there is any, enjoins us to think how an absolute singularity subtracts itself from the community of the common, and thus from the shareable," unquote. Genius then must amount to an opening or interruption in the order of rules and legislation. It follows that if there were no such opening for genius to operate, then there would be nothing but law-governed frameworks that determine and predict in advance what is to be done. Inversely, if there were no genius, originality would not exist. There would only be a strictly circumscribed innovation within fixed limits. Genius, therefore, is the gap that allows for anything new to emerge. This is why art, Kant says, must necessarily be the product of genius. For without this gap, this interruption that genius provides, all forms of creative activity would be simply mechanic. Therefore, the way I see it, genius rebels against the mundane. It seeks to eradicate the common, to rise above the mediocre, and to reach exalted heights. Perhaps we can safely say that in this description we recognize Beethoven, who was labeled unsociable, a rebel, precisely for being a genius and for acting like one. He was labeled mad for breaking the template. But then we remember what Oscar Wilde says, and I quote, "The public is wonderfully tolerant. It forgives everything except genius," unquote. The genius of the young Kant, alongside that of his contemporaries Goethe, Schiller, and Beethoven, derives its peculiar energy from the forces of their time, an era whose strongest incentives for a new life are in the spirit of opposition against existing ideas and institutions. In a sense, they are iconoclasts, rebels of the highest but finest order. More than anyone else, Beethoven lives in this atmosphere and is carried by it. The elemental necessity of his soul to rise above the individual through massive, objective aims distinguishes him from his older classic brothers. The urge for freedom that dominates the second half of the 18th century lives in Beethoven with so much force that even Goethe is scared and stunned by what he calls, I quote, "this untamed personality, this grandiose, great and mad music," unquote. In Beethoven's works, the listener perceives that to a certain degree, the rebel, that is the genius, is drawn to the spiritual sphere of Romanticism. There can be no question as to the numerous threads that lead from him to the Romanticists. But, as I see it, to count him among the Romantics amounts to a fundamental misreading of styles. For Beethoven grows out of the 18th century. The whole immense wealth of that century is concentrated in him. And what he does is to create a new synthesis of classicism and then hand it down to the new century. The romantic elements we might perceive in the sonatas being performed this evening do not contradict his pure classicism, for the effects of the Sturm und Drang create a romantic crisis in all the great classicists. We know that historically Beethoven straddles the classical age and the romantic age in music and letters. He is eminently poised in that sort of liminal space, which is the threshold between classical equilibrium, intellectual clarity and sense of proportion, and its counterpart, rather than opposite, I would say, namely romantic extravagance, emotional outpouring, and a total disregard for proportion. This thesis and antithesis, an Apollonian Dionysian balance like no other, is synthesized in Beethoven in an almost Hegelian sense. On the one hand, this towering figure of the late 18th and early 19th century is a stickler for form, aligning himself to the classical practice emulated by Haydn and Mozart before him. On the other hand, he is a rebel with a cause, challenging accepted tradition not for its own sake, not without a cause, gratuitously, but to make it new, to reconfigure it in a new language, so that it permeates, infuses, and continues to inspire contemporary times. In a sense, he anticipates the modernists. After all, Beethoven, like the first generation of Romantic poets in England, lived during the French Revolutionary period, instigated in the cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité, cries that have echoed down the corridors of history, as Eliot puts it, and which incensed that sizzling rebellious spirit in him that simply would not stay put. There are natures that can only walk tall. In every note of Beethoven, this unassailable stature and proud majesty of soul speaks with convincing assuredness. His music is the incarnation of strength and passion. The emotions in his works are sired by great and fully conscious intentions, governed by ideas, hence their unheard-of unity. The overriding impression they create is that of greatness writ large. It would, arguably, be safe to say that no other musician has ever approached this gigantic willpower. No one has ever coerced so impetuous, demonic a nature in himself into following the dictates of his will under all circumstances, converting his energies into sheer creative power. This trait, the salient feature of his mental disposition, is, then, enhanced and conditioned by the temper of his times. All classicism rests on equilibrium of forces and functions. It seeks relation, proportion, and form, achieving unity in the identity of structure and material. The whole nature of classicism is a middle path, what we would call the Aristotelian golden mean, for equilibrium is the result, not the point of departure. Beethoven is the musician who finds the way to the last confines of classicism, passing from the realm of the beautiful into that of the sublime. In this latter region, such criteria as taste are no longer valid, because in its atmosphere, feeling and sentiment are topped by ethic willpower. Beethoven thus creates for himself a heroic style that unleashes subjective forces unknown to his classical contemporaries. While he flings the doors open, he does not enter the new halls. He remains a true classicist, to whom force is form. However, what gives him his unique position in the world of music, perhaps in the whole history of civilization, is that at the same time, form also serves as force. This means that his form is not externally binding, but liberating, and therefore conducive to deployment and development. Paradoxically, adherence to form is the bondage that sets him free. This form means forming, an active, creative process that acknowledges limitation, for it is not borderless. It demands content. Beethoven's whole art is a triumph of power over material, a triumph of function over substance, of subject over object. Form is essentially subjective with him, and the subjective essentially forming. Also, the more Beethoven advances into the early Romanticism of the 19th century, the more classic he becomes. He is Janus-phased, looking at once backward, expressing the ultimate apotheosis of classicism, and forward, beckoning to the future, a guide and mentor of the 19th century. From the writing of his Heiligenstadt Testament in 1802, which, as I said, is an extraordinary letter to his brothers in which he expresses both despair at his encroaching deafness at the very young age of 32, but also hope, which seems to radiate from the very words that he writes. Up to the composition of the Appassionata Sonata, which is the last work performed this evening, and that Appassionata was finished between 1804 and 1805, so in those 3 years or so, Beethoven produces some of his most pivotal works, music that foreshadows and heralds the arrival of what is commonly identified as the second period of his creativity. Beethoven, it seems, turns inward and begins to produce music only he could fully understand, if that. The creator of art is at the service of that same art. What he creates is much bigger than himself. That's such stuff as genius is made on, to appropriate a phrase from Shakespeare. If Beethoven resigns himself to the futility of his cosmic anger, he also determines to thrust his immense genius in the face of God and man alike, accepting no limitations upon the magnitude or trajectory of his creativity. It is the Beethoven of these works who unleashes the Appassionata Sonata in 1805. While a division of Beethoven's creative years into 3 style periods is customary and feasible, inasmuch as every artist has 1 period each of youth, maturity, and old age, of course, granted that he lives to a mature age, unlike Schubert or Keats, one must be careful not to attribute exclusive characteristics to each of these periods. Some of the most typical innovations, what are known as innovations, of Beethoven's final period, for instance, are present in lesser-known works of his youth. There is also a remarkable fact that at the time he creates the largest of symphonic constructions, he also arrives at an economy and poise of language expressed in the smallest possible forms. I'm referring, for instance, to the epigrams in his last string quartets and the bagatelles for pianoforte. What is really important is that the central thought in Beethoven's works is always the symphonic. However, sonata, chamber music, as well as the symphony, all belong together stylistically, as all of them are dominated by the dramatic dualism of the classical sonata form. The contrasts which agitate the composer find a most adequate and congenial expression in the sonata form. This explains the relatively secondary place of lyricism in his language. The sonata form exudes from Beethoven a tremendous force and a power some critics like to brand demonic. I prefer to call it sublime. Like the symphony, the piano sonata reaches its culmination in Beethoven's 32 works of this type, 32 works belonging to the canon, because he had written at least 3 sonatas in his youth, but which are not kind of referred to as the canonical ones. Tremendously impressed by Clementi's sonatas, Beethoven starts out, as usual, with traditional forms and idioms. But in his hands, the old is transfigured into the new. And the new work, because it is built on the old, consoles, for it is built on the familiar and the unchanging. He does not use the tools of revolution, but if the lawful carrying out of his plans is thwarted, he will not hesitate to take an untried way. Although an entirely new element, I'm referring to the expression of dark and quite sinister mood, which appears as early as the Pathétique Sonata, it is in this sonata that Clementi's inspiration is most fruitful. From this point on, however, he proceeds in his own way, and the classic sonata is soon enriched with variants. His art matures. His constructions increase in dimensions. I hazard to say that no other solo piece anywhere approaches the status of epic as his magnificent Hammerklavier sonata, the Opus 106. An invaluable help in studying Beethoven's mind and process of composition is furnished in his sketchbooks, the little stories he tells us there, happily available to us in modern editions. They disclose a fundamental trait valid in all three periods of his creative years. When technical restrictions interpose themselves between an idea and its realization, Beethoven does not hesitate to violate even ordinary common sense, especially in his vocal writing. What Beethoven hears with his inner ear and what he coerces into a graphic score, he executes no matter whether this is feasible or not. Demonic impetuosity and arbitrary disregard for propriety can give way, however, to the most tender intimacy. As he himself writes in the Heiligenstadt Testament, I quote, "I was born with a fiery, active temperament. Yet my heart and mind prompted me to be kind and tender," unquote. And this tenderness, I think, can be easily perceived in his slow movements, with particular but not exclusive reference to the Appassionata, the Pathétique, the third movement of the Opus 26, all of which will be performed this evening, the Emperor Piano Concerto, and especially the last piano sonata with its seraphic trills. All these embrace the listener with a loving tenderness, a profoundly kind and gentle soul, deeply wounded, and yet daring to give itself to fervent abandonment. That is the kind of soul that speaks to us from these tones, a pure, strong yet vulnerable, infinitely rich human heart. No one else could pass from one extreme to the other without losing their bearings, but Beethoven is never lost. His elemental rebellious power rescues him alike from both sentimentality and excess. One need only recall the little introduction to the fugue of the Hammerklavier, the passion of the first movement of the last piano sonata and of the quartet Opus 132, the humor of the Diabelli variations, and so on. We see here that the constructive possibilities of his themes are inherent. They come to him just like that. The heroic ideal which permeates Beethoven's whole being is the heroism of freedom-loving German classicism. And this keynote is manifested in every one of Beethoven's musical gestures. How truly heroic and uplifting they are, as compared to the decorative and dazzling, but ultimately artificial fanfares of the French school of the empire. The French were all but burnt out at this point. All they could do, seemingly, was to stylize or be theatrical. On the other hand, we listen to Beethoven's Coriolanus and Egmont overtures, the anonymous hero of his Eroica symphony, the Hammerklavier, and the Mass in C. All these are worthy of the ancient epopeia, which means capable of being treated in the epic style. For, like Goethe, standing at the peaks of human knowledge, through his Faust, these works stand at the summit of human nobility. Beethoven proves that true idealism is heroism. With him, one reaches the limits of the classical conception of the heroic, and perhaps the ultimate limits of heroism expressed in music. He comes as the herald of the 19th century, the musical prophet of willpower. No wonder Germany then gives us Wagner. Beethoven rises from the spirit of the war for freedom, and threatened with what for a musician is worse than death, and that is oblivion, he beseeches God to give him strength to what he calls, in the Heiligenstadt Testament, to conquer myself. The firebrand becomes a classicist through self-discipline. The rebel does have a cause. This heroic ideal is perhaps nowhere more spectacularly exhibited than in the Eroica Symphony, which Beethoven completed in 1804, in those 3 years I referred to earlier on. It was introduced privately in Vienna, in the mansion of Prince Lobkowitz, to whom it is dedicated. Despite everything written to the contrary, the Symphony Eroica was never a portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte, although the composer did plan to dedicate it to the brilliant Corsican. He went into a rage, however, when a pupil, later his biographer, Ferdinand Ries, brought news in May 1804 that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. According to Ries, Beethoven shouted that the general was, and I quote from Ries, only an ordinary human being. Beethoven then went to the table, took hold of the title page, tore it in two, and threw it to the floor. Unquote. What Beethoven never told Ries, however, was that Prince Lobkowitz, before May 1804, had proffered a handsome fee in exchange for the dedication, or that Beethoven realized the advantages in bringing with him a Sinfonia Bonaparte, when a Parisian trip was proposed later, but which never materialized. But of course, Beethoven would never be bought. It was conductor Arturo Toscanini who put everything into perspective some 80-odd years ago. I quote from Toscanini, "Some say Napoleon, some say Hitler, some say Mussolini. For me, it is Allegro con brio." Unquote. In a nutshell, art that serves a political agenda is subversive. Left to its own devices, art can reach the sublime, and Toscanini realized that. There are countless beautiful moments in Beethoven, of course, as we know. Then there are those fleeting ones which soar into the sublime, ephemeral in substance, permanent in essence. These motives are rendered by the composer with the character of a thesis, that is, an idea capable of changing the world, as if it were a free act over which no material has precedence. Technically, this requires extreme dynamic intensity. Sound here is no more sensuous attribute, but becomes the condition of something spiritual, of structural meaning. Such moments that speak to me personally in this way occur in the Appassionata, in the funeral march from the magnificent Eroica, the slow movement of Symphony No. 7, and so many more. At this point, Shelley's words from Prometheus Unbound come to mind, and I quote from Shelley. "To suffer woes which hope thinks infinite, to forgive wrongs darker than death or night, to defy power which seems omnipotent, to love and bear, to hope till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates, neither to change nor falter nor repent. This, like thy glory, Titan, is to be good, great and joyous, beautiful and free." Unquote. In conclusion, Robert Schumann, the great composer, wrote, and I quote Schumann now, "Take 100 century-old oak trees and write his name with them in giant letters on a plain, or carve his likeness in colossal proportions like Saint Borromeus on Lake Maggiore, that he may rise above the mountains as he did when living. And when the Rhine ships pass and foreigners ask the name of that giant form, every child may answer, that is Beethoven. And they will think it is the name of a German emperor. But we say, with a genius like Beethoven, who needs emperors?" Blake's quotation at the start of this talk, for me, is strongly allied to the experience of listening to Beethoven's music, one that no flood will sweep away. It speaks with the permanence of all things great. Together with Blake, Beethoven wants us to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. The rebel does have a cause, and that cause is the championing of humanity above all else. What we get from an acquaintance with his music is audible virtue, out of which emerges peace. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If, of course, hopefully that provided sort of a context for this evening's performance, which is an all Beethoven recital. If there are any questions or any comments or anything you wish to discuss, I'd be very happy to take your ideas. Yes?
I find it a sweet irony in celebrating as we are a person with demonic power as the church bells ring and as we're surrounded by religious symbols. The issue of madness also is one that is in some ways something that we must explore, because these are things that have in the past, including demonic possession and goodness knows what, have persecuted people. And I asked the simple question is, how would a Beethoven live in a society like ours here, given his mercurial emotional state and his unsocial kind of tendencies? I've worked extensively with people with autism on the autism spectrum, and I have had the experience of seeing their art, which is astounding and unique and misunderstood by people who are in the art field, including the mother of one of the children who said, "Oh, I don't understand. He doesn't paint things the way things see." But as Van Gogh, he said, "I paint things the way I feel, not the way I see." Anyway, the question I raise as a global thing is, how do we deal with creativeness and not, in some ways, subsume the creative process by our own standards of normalcy?
Yes, a very interesting question, which I have pondered long and deep. The point is that what I try to make, the point I try to make is that the question of genius, right? It's an exception to the rule, right? Genius doesn't occur everywhere, and in all of us. It is this very tenuous relationship between talent and skill, right? So talent is something that you're born with. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, you can't create it in you. You can't acquire it. You can't achieve it by something external. It can't be learned, right? So you find genius in the most unlikely of places and spaces and people, right? And when you think about it, probably, certainly, so much genius has gone kind of untapped, as it were. And, of course, the acquisition of skill, then, if done carefully, it will only make genius more pronounced. It will bring the genius out, but not to the kind of at the expense of genius, right? So skill can possibly be learned, not necessarily so. You can have a genius without being able to learn skill, right? You have genius that seem to be born with skill. And the point is about structure and rules, right? I mean, so the genius does not fit, right? So within, I think, well, this is a political issue as well, political not in the partisan sort of thing, but democracies or some regimes, right? Regimes can stifle genius, right? I mean, that's what I said. I mean, art which has a subversive, has a political agenda, it can become subversive. So genius needs a space to kind of express itself in the most free way, right? And that, of course, is going to clash with what people expect. Some people kind of find themselves, why do I have to obey the rules, whereas you are not allowed, or are allowed to get away with it, as it were. So there are, of course, this is an eternal question. I don't think I have one single answer for that, so I'm not professing I am able to reply to your question, because it's constantly, right, you're constantly thinking about it and reconfiguring it and making it mean in different contexts. But with Beethoven, he also was, we can't not remember that he was absolutely devastated with because of his deafness, right? And for a composer to be deaf, it doesn't get more ironical than that. It is incredible, like a painter going blind, you see. So the oral pertains to music as the visual to painting. So he loses the one quality that he absolutely required. And to rise above that and produce wonderful music, incredible beauty, despite all odds. I mean, he was only about 31 when he started, noticing that he was going deaf. So there's that aspect in his life. He couldn't have been an easy man to live with anyway, right? But that couldn't have made his life easier. And himself, I mean, that Heiligenstadt Testament, it's only 2 pages long. I suggest you read it. It's an extraordinary testament. A legacy that he leaves not only to his brothers, but to us all. Right? I mean, there is absolutely, nihilistic despair everywhere. But the hope he radiates through that very despair, right, is incredible. That's what I felt every time I read it. And therefore had to contend with all these things. And of course, then there was as usual, everywhere, at all time, the rivalry coming from even friends. He fell out spectacularly with one of his brothers, Johann, for some reason. As I said, he wasn't an easy person. But then, of course, all things seem to conspire to make his life even more difficult. And in fact, what you notice from the second period of his creative output, from 1802 till 1815 or so, he starts thinking musically in a different way as well. He starts using forms which he could because he was a very proud man, right? Very proud in a very good sense. Very proud of his work, of course. And he didn't want to make a fool of himself, right? So he wanted to be sure that he didn't get it wrong. But such was the perfection of his inner ear that going deaf, did not make a difference to the way he wrote, to the way his music was received. People didn't say, okay, he's making a fool of himself, he's messing this up. I mean, this is cacophony, this is rubbish. I mean, his music got greater. He started using fugues, for instance, more regularly, because a fugue is there's a mathematical structure to it that you can't really get it wrong. He wanted to lean against something that gave him security, you see. But then, of course, the salient feature of his character, right, this rebellious spirit in him. He was born, that's, I think, the characteristic of genius everywhere. I mean, Michelangelo was difficult. Leonardo was difficult, right? I mean, Chopin was impossible, right? I don't know, great writers like James Joyce. I mean, so they all had this they were bigger than themselves. There was something in them that couldn't be contained. And I'm sure, as you say, that made their life a little bit of hell as well. There's a lot of suffering in the process of creation, as we know. You mentioned Van Gogh. I mean, it was torture.
It's not easy for me at all to thank my sister, but I'm sure that following this brilliant exposition, it will be surely matched by the brilliance of my nephew. That's how it is this evening. What struck me most was when, if I understood correctly, because I'm getting a little bit hard of hearing as well, when she said that Beethoven prayed to God, if I understood well, to give him the grace of self-determination, self-conquering. I don't know if he was familiar with the good book, he must have been, but in Proverbs, actually, there is this, in chapter 16, where it's attributed to Solomon, and he says that merior est qui dominator animus usurpator urbium. Translated roughly, it would be that the man who succeeds in dominating himself is much better than he who succeeds to dominate cities and empires. Actually, Beethoven, in dominating himself, he dominated the world, he dominated time, because everybody speaks about him, and we wouldn't imagine the musical world without him. I don't know if this makes sense, but definitely he must have been in the same vein of Solomon when he prayed to God to give him the grace of self-domination. That's what I augur to each and every one of us. Because in dominating ourselves, we dominate without wanting it. Actually, that's the result of dominating the world, but in a good sense. So I hope to see you this evening. You have the prayer booking, because of this uncomfortable situation. But music vincit omnia, like love. Music dominates everything. Thank you, and see you this evening.